Before he was a saint, he was a hunted terrorist. Did you know Nelson Mandela remained on the U.S. terror watch list until as late as 2008? In 1961, the man the world now calls a global icon of peace made a chilling decision. He co-founded a paramilitary guerrilla group to take down the state by force. A royal-born lawyer, trading his suit for a rebel's uniform. The government called him a traitor. At his trial, facing the gallows, he looked the judge dead in the eye and said, "I am prepared to die." But his real test wasn't the 27 years in a concrete cell. It was the moment he walked out. With 30 million lives teetering on the edge of a bloody civil war, the fate of South Africa hung on just one man's voice. This isn't just a story of kindness. It's the profile of a strategic genius who realized the most lethal weapon wasn't a gun. It was the ability to master his enemy's soul. This is how Nelson Mandela saved his country from a collective suicide. The story of Nelson Mandela is often told as a saintly myth, but the reality is far more jagged. It is a transformation that defies political logic, a journey from the royal courts of the Transkei to the damp, suffocating concrete of a Robben Island cell, and finally to the presidency of a nation that once wanted him dead. He was born Ralilela Mandela. In his native Xhosa, the name literally means troublemaker. It was a prophecy wrapped in a birthright. Raised in the village of Kunu, Mandela was meticulously groomed for leadership within the Thembu royal court. This was where he mastered the ancient art of the imbizo, traditional meetings where every voice was heard before a consensus was reached. It was here he learned the philosophy that would define his life, that a leader is like a shepherd, staying behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, while the rest follow, unaware that all along they are being directed from behind. But the troublemaker eventually rejected the gilded cage of a royal advisor. He fled an arranged marriage and the constraints of a tribal future, arriving in Johannesburg, the Golden City, not as a prince, but as a fugitive. The urban landscape of the 1940s was a visceral shock to his system. For the first time, the systemic brutality of apartheid was no longer a distant rumor discussed by elders. It was a daily, suffocating reality. Mandela stood in the filth of the ghettos, watched the police batons rise against peaceful protesters, and felt the weight of laws designed to classify and confine a human being based solely on the color of their skin. If you value these deep dives into history's most complex figures, please like and subscribe to support our research. Now, back to the streets of Johannesburg. When the young, elegant Nelson Mandela first walked the streets of the Golden City, he was a man caught between two clashing worlds. He possessed the quiet self-assurance of royalty, yet he lived under a regime that viewed him as a second-class citizen. It was during this period of displacement that he met Walter Sisulu, the man who would become his mentor and the architect of his political awakening. Sisulu saw something in Mandela, not just his height and dignified bearing, but a rare, magnetic charisma. With Sisulu's help, Mandela secured a clerkship at a white-owned law firm, a near impossibility for a black man in that era. He spent his days immersed in the intricacies of a law designed to oppress him, and his nights studying by candlelight to earn his degree. This struggle culminated in a historic milestone. Together with his friend Oliver Tambo, he opened Mandela and Tambo, the first black-owned law office in South Africa. Their office became a sanctuary for the broken. Mandela represented the ordinary citizens crushed by the gears of apartheid, families evicted from ancestral homes, laborers robbed of their wages, and men arrested for simply existing in the wrong zone. This experience was a turning point. The courtroom became Mandela's first true political stage. He used the law to expose the inherent hypocrisy of a system that preached justice while enforcing tyranny. He realized that a country boy's charm was no longer enough. He had become a sophisticated urban intellectual who understood that the battles fought in the courtroom were only a prelude to the war that had to be waged on the streets. His involvement with the ANC Youth League marked a radical shift in his psyche. Alongside Sisulu, Tambo, and the fiery Anton Lembede, Mandela championed a new, assertive strategy. They were done with polite protest letters and humble petitions to a government that met peace with live ammunition. They moved toward mass action, boycotts, and strikes. They were a generation of passionate rebels who shared one singular, dangerous belief: that freedom was not a gift to be granted by the oppressor, but a prize to be seized by the oppressed. The troublemaker had found his cause, but the path ahead was paved with calculated risks and immense personal sacrifices, a path that would eventually lead him into the mouth of the lion itself. How did a lawyer dedicated to the word of law decide that the only way to break a system was to go underground? And what was the secret Black Pimpernel era that made him the most hunted man in Africa? As the 1950s drew to a close, the shadows over South Africa grew longer and darker. The Nationalist Party's apartheid regime abandoned all pretense of reform, turning increasingly ruthless. For Nelson Mandela, the bitter conclusion was unavoidable. The era of nonviolent resistance was dead. The breaking point came in 1960 at Sharpeville. In a single afternoon of horror, police opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters, leaving 69 people dead in the dust. The ANC was banned, forced into the shadows. Mandela, realizing the movement was being strangled, went underground. This was the birth of the Black Pimpernel. The press gave him this nickname as he led the police on a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game for months. He became a master of disguise. One day, a humble driver, the next a gardener or a cook, slipping through checkpoints to organize the resistance. During this period of secrecy, Mandela made the most controversial decision of his life, co-founding Umkhonto we Sizwe, or the Spear of the Nation. He was a pacifist by nature, but a pragmatist by necessity. If the government uses violence to meet peace, he argued, the people have no choice but to hit back. He secretly crossed borders, seeking military training in Ethiopia and support in London. His strategy was surgical: sabotage economic targets, power lines, railways, government offices, to make the country unmanageable without mass casualties. But this shift changed everything. To the West and the apartheid regime, he was no longer a freedom fighter. He was a terrorist. His name was whispered in revolutionary cells and feared in the corridors of power, all while he lived a life of constant tension, estranged from his wife Winnie and haunted by the fear that every sunrise might be his last. History is rarely black and white. If you're finding this deep dive into Mandela's transformation insightful, please hit like and subscribe. Mandela's legendary status was forged not in victory, but in a courtroom. During the 1963 to 1964 Rivonia trial, he faced the very real prospect of the gallows. Accused of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the state, Mandela did something extraordinary. He turned his own prosecution into an indictment of the regime. Instead of begging for mercy, Mandela delivered a speech that lasted over 4 hours. It was titled, "I Am Ready to Die." He didn't deny his role in the armed struggle. He explained its historical necessity. He spoke of the systemic dehumanization of his people and directly addressed the fears of the white minority, dreaming of a society where all races lived in harmony. The climax of his speech silenced the courtroom. "I have fought against white domination, and I have also fought against black domination. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge seemed momentarily shaken by the moral nobility of the man in the dock. Mandela was sentenced to life imprisonment instead of death, transforming himself from a prisoner of the state into the living conscience of a nation. His words were smuggled out, sparking a global anti-racism firestorm that the apartheid government could never hope to extinguish. They sent him to Robben Island, a desolate rock off the coast of Cape Town, designed to break his will and erase his name from history. Cell 466 to 64 was a tomb of damp concrete, less than 2 meters wide. For nearly 2 decades, his world was a cycle of forced labor in a limestone quarry. The conditions were brutal. The blinding white glare of the sun reflecting off the limestone caused permanent damage to his eyesight, leaving him unable to shed tears for the rest of his life. The work was intended to turn political giants into broken laborers. But Mandela and his comrades, like Walter Sisulu, refused to be subdued. They turned the limestone quarry into what they called Robben Island University. While breaking rocks, they held disciplined, whispered seminars on history, philosophy, and political theory. Mandela was the undisputed chancellor of this clandestine school. He enforced a strict code of conduct. They would treat the guards with respect, not out of weakness, but as a strategic assertion of their own moral superiority. Even in isolation, restricted to only 2 letters and 2 visitors a year, his correspondence often mutilated by censors, Mandela remained a brilliant strategist. He led hunger strikes for better food and fought for access to books, proving that while the regime held his body captive, his mind remained a sovereign territory they could never invade. But as the years turned into decades, a question began to haunt the world. Could a man emerge from 27 years of darkness without a heart full of vengeance? The answer would shock both his enemies and his friends. Perhaps the most extraordinary and often misunderstood aspect of Mandela's 27 years in captivity was his decision to systematically study his enemy. While many of his comrades in the ANC remained understandably consumed by bitterness, Mandela recognized a cold, hard truth. To defeat apartheid, he had to master the psychology of the men who enforced it. He began to learn Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor. To some of his fellow prisoners, this felt like a betrayal. They met his new hobby with confusion and even white-hot anger. But Mandela was looking decades ahead. He spent his hours reading Afrikaner history and poetry, seeking to dissect the lager mentality, that defensive, circled wagon obsession with survival that drove the white minority to cling so desperately to power. He realized that the Afrikaners were not merely colonial occupiers who could be driven into the sea. They were a people who felt they had nowhere else to go, shaped by their own history of suffering under the British Empire. By learning their tongue, Mandela was arming himself with the ultimate weapon for peace. He began to speak to his prison guards in their own language, discussing rugby and their families, slowly eroding the walls of racial prejudice from the inside out. This wasn't mere friendliness. It was a deeply calculated strategic maneuver. He was preparing for a day when he would sit across from these men at a negotiating table. He knew that if he could speak to their hearts in the language of their childhood, he could navigate their deepest fears and find a path toward a shared future. This was no soft, sentimental idealism. It was a hard-won intellectual position forged in the crucible of forced labor. Mandela's vision was radical. He didn't want to replace white supremacy with black supremacy. He wanted to dissolve the very concept of racial supremacy forever. By the mid-1980s, South Africa had reached a violent, bloody stalemate. The country was in a state of perpetual emergency. Townships were in open revolt, and the international community was strangling the Pretoria regime with economic sanctions and cultural boycotts. The government, led by the iron-fisted P.W. Botha, realized that a dead Mandela, or even a Mandela behind bars, was becoming more dangerous than a free man. They offered him his freedom multiple times, but always with a poison pill condition. He had to renounce violence as a political instrument. Mandela's responses were masterclasses in political defiance. In 1985, his daughter Zinzi stood before a massive, roaring crowd in Soweto and read his words. "What freedom am I being offered while the organization of the people is banned? Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." But while his public face remained unyielding, Mandela began a high-stakes, secret diplomacy. Without a formal mandate from the ANC leadership in exile, an act that could have branded him a traitor, he initiated talks with high-ranking government officials. These meetings were held in sterile office buildings or hospital rooms where he was being treated for tuberculosis. It was a tectonic shift. Mandela was testing the waters, slowly convincing the regime that he was not the communist terrorist portrayed in their propaganda, but a pragmatic leader who offered the only way out of the abyss. He was the bridge between a civil war that would leave the country in ashes and a future that had never been tried. While Mandela engaged in this invisible diplomacy, the world outside was consumed by a Mandela mania, unlike anything ever seen for a political prisoner. He had become a secular martyr, a global icon whose face was known to millions, even though no new photograph of him had been released since 1964. The peak of this phenomenon came in 1988 with the free Nelson Mandela concert at London's Wembley Stadium. Broadcast to 67 countries, it transformed a regional struggle into a global pop culture movement. When artists like Stevie Wonder and Tracy Chapman sang for his release, they made the anti-apartheid cause a moral imperative for a new generation. In the United States, the tide had completely turned. Even over President Reagan's veto, the passage of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act signaled that the regime's traditional allies were finally walking away. The pressure on the South African government was becoming unbearable. Mandela was a ghost that haunted the halls of power in Pretoria. Every diplomatic summit, every trade negotiation was overshadowed by his absence. The regime tried to portray him as an aging, irrelevant figure, but the more they suppressed his image, the more powerful his legend grew. He was the man of the century before he had even set foot outside his prison walls. This global leverage was exactly what Mandela needed for his secret talks. He knew he had the world at his back, and the government knew that as long as Mandela remained in a cell, they would remain pariahs. The stage was finally set for one of the most dramatic, heart-stopping moments of the 20th century. The climax of this decades-long drama reached its breaking point on February 11th, 1990. The world held its collective breath as the gates of Victor Verster Prison, where Mandela had spent his final years in a relatively comfortable cottage, swung open. For the first time in 10,000 days, Nelson Mandela was a free man. As he walked out hand in hand with his wife, Winnie, his fist was raised high in the iconic ANC salute. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated catharsis for millions across the globe. He appeared older. His hair had turned a shock of snowy white, and his gait was slower, but the aura of authority and his regal dignity were completely undiminished. That evening, standing on the balcony of Cape Town City Hall before a massive, jubilant sea of people, his first words were not of vengeance or triumph. They were words of profound humility. He referred to himself as a humble servant of you, the people. He reaffirmed the ANC's goals, but the signal was clear. He was ready to negotiate a peaceful transition to a democracy that included everyone. However, the release of Mandela was not the end of apartheid. It was the beginning of the agonizingly difficult work of dismantling it. For the next 4 years, Mandela navigated a political minefield of right-wing extremism, township violence, and deep-seated suspicion. He entered grueling negotiations with President F.W. de Klerk, a man with whom he shared a complex relationship of mutual respect and intense personal animosity. They would eventually share the Nobel Peace Prize, but the road to that stage was paved with the bodies of those killed in violence fanned by third force elements within the state security apparatus who wanted to see the country burn. The true test of Mandela's leadership, and the moment South Africa almost collapsed, came in April 1993. Chris Hani, the charismatic leader of the Communist Party and a hero to the militant black youth, was assassinated in his driveway by a white supremacist. The country was on the absolute precipice of a racial civil war. Angry crowds took to the streets. The government lost control. The air tasted of smoke and revolution. In that moment of existential crisis, it was not President de Klerk who addressed the nation. It was Nelson Mandela. He went on national television and delivered a speech of such gravity and calm that it effectively stopped a war. He spoke as a father to a grieving nation. He acknowledged the white-hot anger, but made a masterstroke of reconciliation. He pointed out that while a white man had pulled the trigger, it was a white woman, a neighbor, who had called the police to identify the assassin. This simple observation reminded the country that their common humanity was more powerful than the hatred of a few. Mandela's intervention didn't just save the peace. It proved he was already the de facto leader of South Africa. He used the tragedy to force the government to set a firm date for the first democratic elections. He realized that every day the transition dragged on was another opportunity for saboteurs to destroy the future. His ability to channel the collective grief of the black majority into a disciplined push for political change remains perhaps his greatest achievement. April 27, 1994, was a day that seemed impossible for most of South Africa's history. Millions of black South Africans stood in lines that snaked for miles across the dusty plains of the Karoo and through the hilly townships of KwaZulu-Natal. For the first time, they were not temporary residents or subjects, they were citizens. The images from that day are legendary. Elderly women being carried to the polls in chairs, and former prisoners standing alongside their former jailers to cast their ballots. It was the ultimate peaceful victory over the ideology of apartheid. The ANC won a decisive victory, and on May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as the first black president of South Africa. The event was attended by world leaders from every corner of the earth, including the very men who had once branded him a terrorist. In his inaugural address, he spoke the words that would define his legacy. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Mandela's presidency was not about the exercise of power for its own sake. It was about the performance of reconciliation. He knew the white minority, who still controlled the economy and the military, were terrified of black revenge. His task was to convince them that the Rainbow Nation was more than a slogan. It was a viable political reality. He chose to build a nation not on the bones of his enemies, but on the foundation of a shared, democratic future. History often asks us if one person can truly change the world. The life of Nelson Mandela provides the answer. He showed us that even after 27 years of darkness, a human being can emerge not with a heart of stone, but with a soul large enough to forgive an entire empire. If this journey from prisoner to president moved you, we invite you to be a part of our community. Your support helps us keep the stories of these giants alive, ensuring that the lessons of the past are never lost to the shadows of the future. Thank you for walking this long road with us. One of the most iconic moments of Nelson Mandela's presidency, and perhaps the most brilliant piece of political theater in modern history, occurred on a rugby pitch in 1995. For decades, rugby was the sacred sport of the Afrikaner elite, a symbol of white physical prowess and racial exclusion. To the black majority, the green and gold jersey of the Springboks was a hated uniform of the oppressor. But Mandela saw a golden opportunity. He realized that if he could get black South Africans to support the Springboks, and if he could show the white minority that he embraced their most cherished tradition, he could forge a national unity that no policy paper ever could. He struck up an unlikely, legendary friendship with the young Afrikaner captain, Francois Pienaar. Mandela didn't just support the team from a distance. He visited their training camps, learned their names, and became their greatest advocate. When South Africa reached the final against the New Zealand All Blacks, the air in Johannesburg was electric with a tension that felt like a rebirth. Mandela walked onto the field at Ellis Park wearing that green jersey, the ultimate symbol of Afrikaner identity. In that moment, the predominantly white crowd of 65,000 didn't boo. They began to chant his name. Nelson, Nelson, Nelson. It was a profound transformation. When South Africa won in a thrilling overtime finish, Mandela presented the trophy to Pienaar, saying, "Thank you for what you have done for South Africa." Pienaar's reply would echo through history. "No, Mr. President, thank you for what you have done for South Africa." In that single afternoon, a game became the funeral of the old South Africa and the birth of the new. While the World Cup provided symbolic unity, the actual healing of a broken nation required a much more painful, visceral process. Mandela faced an impossible choice. Should he opt for Nuremberg-style trials that might provoke a white military coup, or a policy of forgive and forget that would leave victims without justice? His government chose a radical middle path, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC. Chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, The TRC offered amnesty to those who had committed political crimes, but only if they made a full public confession. For years, the nation sat transfixed as the horrors of the past were laid bare on television. Mothers sat across from the men who had tortured their sons. Security police detailed the gruesome ways they had disposed of bodies. It was traumatizing and grueling, but Mandela believed it was the only way to lave the wounds of the nation. He wanted the truth to be an unerasable part of the public record. Mandela himself led by example, inviting his former jailers to state dinners and visiting the widow of Hendrik Verwoerd, the primary architect of apartheid. He understood that reconciliation was not a one-time event, but a continuous, difficult practice of choosing the future over the past. In a continent where many post-colonial leaders clung to power for decades, often becoming the very dictators they had once fought, Nelson Mandela performed one final act of revolutionary leadership. He walked away. In 1999, after serving only one 5-year term, Mandela retired. He was 81 years old, and he wanted to set a permanent precedent for democratic succession. He understood that for democracy to survive, it had to be bigger than any one individual. By stepping down, he cemented the foundation of the country's constitutional order. His retirement was far from quiet. He became a global advocate for human rights and a fierce champion in the fight against HIV/AIDS. After his own son, Makatho, died of a disease in 2005, Mandela broke the stigma by announcing the cause of death publicly, urging his people to treat the illness with compassion rather than shame. He remained the moral compass of the nation, occasionally emerging to criticize his own party when he felt it was losing its way. When Nelson Mandela passed away on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95, the world entered a period of mourning that transcended all borders. His funeral was attended by nearly 100 heads of state, a testament to his status as the universal symbol of the human spirit's triumph. But as the eulogies faded, the true challenge remained. South Africa still struggles with deep inequality, corruption, and the lingering scars of its history. Mandela did not leave behind a perfect utopia. He left behind a democratic framework and a moral example. His life is a testament to the idea that the most powerful weapon in the world is not the gun or the bomb, but the capacity of the human heart to forgive the unforgivable. He showed us that leadership is not about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. He moved from being a prince to a prisoner, and finally to a president, but throughout that long walk, he remained Ralilola, the troublemaker who challenged the world to be better than it was. His story reminds us that no system of oppression is eternal, and that even in the darkest cell, the light of human dignity can never be fully extinguished. The long walk to freedom was not just Mandela's. It is a walk he invited all of us to join. If his story of courage and reconciliation moved you, please consider subscribing to join our community. Your support allows us to keep the legacy of history's greatest figures alive for the next generation. Thank you for watching.